You used the term filtering. Did you say that revelation was filtering reason or reason filtering revelation? Well, I guess I'd be bold enough to say both have to be true. There are inevitable and extremely valuable feedback loops in both directions between our faithful openness to revelation and our confidence in some essential premises of human reason.
All right, welcome to Cwic Show. My guest is Ralph Hancock. He is a BYU professor of political philosophy. He has been at BYU for 34 years and seen a lot of change there. He did his undergrad at BYU. He did his master's and his PhD at Harvard in political philosophy. He teaches the tradition of political philosophy as well as contemporary political theory. His research and writing focus on the meaning and limits of modern rationalism in relation to religious and ethical political traditions. He's twice taught as a visiting professor at the University of Rennes, France. How do I say that, Ralph?
Rennes is right, or Rennes.
Okay. And was a visiting scholar at Liberty Fund in Indianapolis. He is the author of Calvin and the Foundations of Modern Politics, and as well as The Responsibility of Reason, Theory and Practice in a Liberal Democratic Age. He's also the editor of America, the West, and Liberal Education. Ralph, a lot I want to go through here. First of all, I'm going to talk just a little bit. We want to go over BYU a little bit and focus in there. I want to go over revelation and reason and how we work those two things together. And then I want to talk a little bit about political philosophy and seeing how things are manifesting. We're in such a tribalized, agitated environment right now with politics, very polarized. And I want to get your take on kind of the DNA of all of this. How do we arrive where we're at here today? What has brought us here? But first, let's go to BYU. I've seen a lot of changes that have happened at BYU. I've followed, for example, a lot of the hard left ideology for about, not at BYU, but in the United States, especially for about the last 9 years, since 2012. I have never brought it up in the show until this year when I started getting emails from a number of people at BYU, and that included faculty, that includes administration, that includes professors and students. And they were telling me what was going on. I was a little bit shocked. I knew some of this was happening, but a lot was going on there. You've been there 34 years. Where are we at now in terms of honestly, a political environment at BYU as compared to when you first got there?
Well, where we are at is kind of predictable, I have to say, in the sense that the underlying causes or the structural features have long been there that lead to where we are and that haven't been altered in any significant way. I would say that there has been an acceleration in certain changes at BYU, but it simply mirrors acceleration of changes that you mentioned that are buffeting, roiling our larger society, and BYU is far from immune to these things. It hasn't been immunized. It hasn't been. Hasn't taken care to resist the drift that is now accelerating. So if I cast about for an image of where we are, I think of a water park with a big slide that's kind of gentle at the beginning with an increasing slope, and the slope has been slippery all along, but now we're at an accelerating pace that is on the one hand kind of dizzying and in that way surprising, but structurally fairly predictable.
Okay, so I think especially in the last maybe 5 years even or less, it's really, it seems to me like it's really intensified. I want to set the stage a little bit here in something you bring up. I believe it was in your book, but it's from Elder Holland here when he was president at BYU 1988. That's when I was there, actually. Says you say in 1988, Jeffrey R. Holland, then BYU's president, proposed a positive linkage between our educational and religious missions when he urged the faculty to resist hyper-specialization, by which we seek merely to imitate others or win their approval, and instead to assume the responsibility of those educated and spiritual and wise to sort, sift, prioritize, integrate, and give some sense of wholeness to great eternal truths. And you say about that, you say, but the machinery of specialization was already in place and it has only accelerated. Ralph, what do you mean by the hyper-specialization, and why is that something that would be so important for President Holland at that time to warn against? He seems to want this wholeness approach or a holistic approach of some sort. Why the specialization? Why is that a problem?
Okay, a couple of comments first. This speech by Jeffrey R. Holland as president of BYU, 1988, A School in Zion, is the greatest speech ever, in my opinion, about BYU's mission. There have been other fine speeches before and after, but put me down as a kind of, as regarding this as scripture and deep philosophy regarding BYU's mission. It's a very striking and powerful speech. And the language you quoted about wholeness and wisdom and integration, all you have to do is to understand the significance of the speech is to measure how, I mean, it was already distinctive, maybe a little surprising 30-something years ago when he gave the speech, but how absolutely quaint and irrelevant. And you can hardly imagine a BYU president talking that way today, because who would listen? What would it even mean? There's a measure of how far we have drifted. So I want to come back to the theme of specialization, but as we talk about BYU, let me offer some qualifying remarks. I am a BYU professor, grateful to be one. I've been treated well by my colleagues and my file leaders. I'm not a disgruntled employee of BYU. I love BYU. And furthermore, I recognize that you're going to hear me criticize BYU in terms of laying hold on its mission in the most serious way. But let me say that we need to recognize at the outset this mission, as described in unsurpassed way by President Holland, this mission is a hard one. There's no obvious way to pull it off. And as we see in President Holland's talk, it has to do with a theme that you have anticipated between us, and that is the whole problem of Athens and Jerusalem, reason and revelation. This is referenced in his talk. So getting BYU anywhere close to fulfilling, or let's say seriously engaging its mission, is a task of the highest order, I would say, intellectually and spiritually. So the fact that we fall short shouldn't be surprising. There are 1,000 ways to go wrong, ways, you could say, if you will, on the left and on the right, progressive and reactionary ways of going wrong in getting this difficult mission right. So I want to acknowledge all that. It's not as if the leadership or the faculty as a whole were just sincere and, followed the mission sincerely, then everything would fall into place. No, it's intrinsically a difficult mission. It's a difficult mission to not only reconcile a university based upon restoration Christianity, as I like to say, the restored gospel, with a commitment to rigorous reason and disciplined scholarship. That's a challenge in and of itself. But given that, given the path, given the drift more generally of the academy in America and in the developed world more generally, given the path of higher education and its vulnerability, its porousness, the porousness of higher education to cultural trends and obsessions and ideologies that are remote from the gospel, this is inherently a very challenging task. In a way, my complaint is that we haven't measured the difficulty of the challenge adequately. So we imagine that we can, sure, we'll be good scholars and then nice guys and pious Latter-day Saints at the same time. And what could possibly go wrong? Well, like everything could possibly go wrong. And beginning with the problem of specialization that President Holland so pointedly calls our attention to. Why is specialization a problem? Because the specialization inherent in the construction of the academic disciplines, sciences, social sciences, humanities, all of them partake of this. And this is just part of the model, the collective model of modern science, beginning with modern natural science. We could trace this back to Descartes, René Descartes founding modern philosophy. Specialization is built into the very successful process of modern science and modern scholarship. And it's worked, it's produced amazing material benefits.
Why would it be a problem though then?
Why is it a problem? Because the whole premise of specialization is to exclude the very holistic questions of the larger wisdom that President Holland evoked. The onward march of the disciplines works only by setting aside questions of why and of integration, the sifting, sorting, prioritizing that President Holland refers to. The whole premise is don't ask larger questions, just adopt the models of this discipline, which are, ever multiplying, being refined, becoming more specialized, subdiscipline within subdiscipline. Apply those models in a sort of apply this template to whatever you can shake a stick at and see what results, and set aside any questions about larger questions about human nature, about the human condition, about the purpose of all this, about the finalities of these modes of scholarship. That's built into the DNA of the modern university.
So Ralph, I mean, the farther we get down into and deeper into specialization, for example, I can think of the sociology department right now, right, where you're going into more and more disciplined areas. You can do the same thing in psychology. You can do, all of these areas. I mean, political philosophy. The further you're going to move down into specialization, the further academia moves into specialization. Are you saying the further it pulls away from the gospel?
The further it becomes deaf to the questions that the gospel would be speaking to us. But I have to address a paradox at this point, because this scientific specialization seems to be the opposite of the ideological fervor that I think both you and I are concerned with. But it's essential to see that these two apparent opposites conspire together, or they're two sides of the same coin. The more we deny that there is any reasonable and rational, any reasoned path to a larger wisdom, including a moral wisdom about human purposes, including the purposes of a university, the more we suppress those larger questions, the more the vacuum is filled by, in a word, by ideology, by the ideological passions that shape the larger society. Just think of it this way, that we are caught in a way between the mutually reinforcing poles of science or objectivity and freedom or subjectivity. On the one hand, we're committed to a kind of scientific neutrality. On the other hand, what fills the moral space that we have evacuated, including the large questions that President Holland would have us raise, what fills the moral space is ever radicalized ideas of freedom and equality, the imagination that we can be liberated from all religious and traditional moral restraints and find some kind of equality and freedom somehow meshed together that would satisfy all human longings, well, blah, blah, blah. Don't get me started. But those are the science, and the radical objectivity and the radical freedom or subjectivity are two sides of the same very powerful coin.
Okay, so I mean, if I go back, and I want to qualify things as well, I think I've done this with the audience before, but I love BYU as well. That's why I do this, because I am very concerned about where things are going. As I said before, I since I started doing this several months ago, I honestly, Ralph, I'm getting hundreds of emails and contact submissions about what people are saying and hearing, and so it's very concerning to me where this is going, because, well, we'll get to this in a minute, but I want to go back just a little bit. In a couple of your talks, in fact, your FAIR talk, I think, was also back in 2013. You had talked about the concern of what you at the time called a new liberalism, or I think it was a new liberalism, and where this was going right now in academia and at BYU. You traced it back to the 60s and to some degree. And I think, if you go back to like Herbert Marcuse and kind of what he wanted to accomplish coming out of the Frankfurt School, and really the organization that went on back in the 60s, and where the radical left, as compared to a classical liberal left, right, started to battle each other. You had basically the civil rights movement, which was more of a classical liberal. Let's hold up our American ideals. Martin Luther King saying, let's assimilate to American ideals because we're not meeting them, right? We're not meeting them for everybody, and we need to meet them for everybody. And on the other side, it was very different, right? It was, going to Herbert Marcuse's repressive tolerance, for example. We're not going to tolerate anything from the other side. We don't like the civil rights ideas. We want something much more radical that's been put in place. It seems to me that since then, little by little, academia has started to move more and more away from an American idealism of the civil rights, say, for example, of Martin Luther King, and much more over into the radical side of things. And it continues to grow. And when you don't have tolerance for the other side, which is what Marcuse really pushed for, you eliminate checks and balances within departments, within administration, et cetera. You can look at polls recently of the trend of those who are hired in all areas of university, faculty, going in administration, professors, et cetera. And it has moved very, very much to the left. And I think in academia to see something where there is a little bit of a leaning left. I think you want a little bit of openness for, searching ideas out, et cetera, in a classical liberal sense. But I believe the numbers that I saw recently, they were pushing 90% of those that are hired at universities with professors at universities are on the left, and over 20% of those in this, for example, the sociology departments were self-proclaimed Marxists. So where do we stand now in academia? If that's where academia is moving to, where it's going to be lockstep, that's how it looks to me right now. It's going to be lockstep in a certain ideology, in a leftist ideology, not a liberal ideology, a leftist ideology. How does BYU say we're in the world but not of the world? We're in academia but not of academia. And as that disparity grows between the mission of BYU and the mission of academia, how does BYU possibly navigate that?
A very short answer, and then let me back up and try to pick up on some of the very big themes. You ask hard questions, Greg. I had 10-minute answers to about a dozen things that you mentioned there, but let me see what I can pull together here. Because first, in answer to your question, you have named the challenge well, and it can only get worse. I mean, this process feeds off itself. I mean, once you reach some critical mass, and what was it? Once you had 60, 70% of leftish domination in the academy, how would it not grow further still? The people hire people that they think are smart in the way that they are smart. And of course, this is what, if you told people in the 90% this statistic you just cited, they would say, well, of course, we're the smart people. That's why we're on the left. This is what they think. Who do you think they're going to hire? Who are they going to promote? What kinds of publications and teachings are they going to reward? And so once you reach a critical mass, it goes in that direction. The momentum, it snowballs. What to do about it? Well, the first thing to say is like something. The first thing to say is, if you don't do something about it, what do you think is going to happen? That's the accelerating drift, or the increasing the acceleration down the slippery slope that I described earlier. So that, to paraphrase a well-known statement by a conservative publisher, public intellectual, what he said was, if any institution, thinking of universities or private foundations, think tanks, any institution that is not deliberately, intentionally conservative will be liberal, or will drift with the larger society. BYU is not exempt from this logic. So a short answer is, unless you have some definite approach and policy, and God forbid we should use the name conservative, in any way to represent the cultural tendencies with which we might be more sympathetic than other cultural tendencies. But unless you have a deliberate, incentivized policy to hire, promote, reward people who are not only in terms of an assent to the faith, more or less superficial or more or less profound, but unless you have a policy actually to seek out people who have deeply internalized a countercultural mission, and to retain and reward those people, what do you think is going to happen? You're going to follow the flow of the rest of the world, the way of all flesh. And I think that's what's happening. We hear many fine speeches, and we're going to hear another set next week as BYU opens its conferences. And by the way, I don't know when this will be broadcast, but we'll want to pay attention to Elder Holland's speech at the beginning of this conference next Monday, October 23rd. It will be about things we're talking about here, I'm quite sure. I was saying we've had many fine speeches with which I wholeheartedly agree. They can tend to be a little bit vague and non-committal, but the fact is they connect in no way with the incentives on the ground. So the faculty assents to them with varying degrees of sincerity, no doubt, as in any human institution. And then they do what they do because they're getting paid to do what they've already been doing. And we've outsourced our hiring and promotion, in effect, to professional associations, publications, peer networks that are at best various in their proximity to BYU's mission.
I think that and that's another concern, right? It's who's hiring, what are the filters there, what are the requirements, and I think obviously there's still it's not run amok, so to speak, but it is concerning to think about how who are they targeting in terms of ideology, and because that's what I'm hearing, right? I mean, I'm hearing about the hiring practices right now, of what's going on there and what people are looking for, and and they use, from what I'm hearing, again, I'm just second hand here, but they're looking at things where they're saying, responses to certain people that are using traditional answers to questions in interviews and different things like that is, well, no, I don't think we can hire him because he's a misogynist, right? Or simply because he believes in a traditional family. And so you have these responses where all of a sudden you're bringing in this identitarian ideology from the hard left of critical race theory and intersectionality and different things like that all of a sudden become the filters of how people are hired or promoted. I'm getting the same thing on promotions, being placed on committees and different things like this, getting full professorship. These are filters that I'm hearing about that are being put into place. I see this in the last several years, this acceleration of what you might call critical social justice, or what I usually will call postmodern critical theory of this hydra of a social justice ideology, where right now, anyway, the biggest head of all of that is, I think, critical race theory, but there's several heads to it. But my biggest concern is that this ideology is going to continue to grow, and because it is growing, and that the kids that are going there are leaving a traditional home. When I say traditional, I mean a traditional LDS home where they're having family home evening. They're doing their scripture study. The kids have gone to their seminary, and they're active in the church. And then all of a sudden, as a freshman, and a couple of emails I got in the first week or two, they get there and they're taught something completely different. And I'm not saying this is completely, permeated everything there. That's not what I'm saying, but these are examples, at least, where they're all of a sudden being taught, no, the Family Proclamation is not necessarily doctrine. Fine. And maybe we don't need to look at this, but we need to look a little bit more at this ideology of social justice and intersectionality, because these are important things. And this is what you really need to pay attention to. That's a shock, I think, to a lot of kids who have left their nest and been taught something. And now all of a sudden, it's really easy to say, oh, well, my seminary teachers, and especially my parents, just don't know what they're talking about. Right? Because now I'm put into this new environment. I'm an adult, and this is the real world. And in the real world, this is the way it really is.
Well, Greg, I have to say, what would one expect if you're hiring professors off the shelf? I mean, off the professional shelf. What's on offer from Harvard or Stanford or Duke or Michigan State? From the prestigious graduate programs in whatever discipline you're in. What do you expect if that's your main criterion? And how can you expect not to build up a critical mass of faculty whose worldviews, whose overlay of a certain secular, that's kind of a loaded, crude term, but let's leave it there for now, whose overlay of a certain secular worldview that is baked into the cake of our academic disciplines, first tends to compete with and then to overcloud or overwhelm the intellectual positions that ought to be implicit in the gospel. What do you expect if that's who you're hiring off the shelf, and then relying upon those people to hire the next generation? Because the hiring process is very fundamentally devolved onto departments that take all the initiative and for the most part receive a stamp of approval from colleges and the university. Now, let me say there's always been a filtering system. The Temple Recommend and Bishop's recommendation have been the anchors of that filtering system. And you can think about that. Are those adequate, or what could possibly go wrong if you're relying upon the possession of a Temple Recommend and the advice of a bishop to hire people to handle the integration of faith and intellect at the highest level? What could possibly go wrong? I do think actually there are many signs of things tightening up, of Salt Lake City shortening BYU's leash, which has been pretty long and loose in the past for reasons that are quite understandable and with which in some ways I sympathize. But nevertheless, there is a tightening up. You've probably read about the change of policy in the College of Religious Education having to do with hiring, and every department in college should be thinking, might this apply in some way to us, and what would that mean? And I'm not saying, by the way, that I in every way welcome or am optimistic about this ramping up of the ecclesiastical filter. I certainly understand the need for it, but things can go wrong in that direction too. There's really no substitute for leadership at some decisive level that fully grasps the task of I was going to say preserving or moving forward with BYU's mission in the face of a cultural drift that is very definitely opposed to it. So for all the mission statements we read, if you don't read about the need to counter the cultural, ideological, spiritual, moral drift of the rest of society, we're not seriously engaging the problem. But consider what Elder Holland says. Consider President Kimball's second century address that I think President Holland quoted in 1988. And there you'll find some real clear instruction that this mission will not be fulfilled unless we deliberately not do what other universities are doing.
One thing that really stands out in the messaging to me from BYU is the proclamation on the family. And that seems to me, of all things, that seems to me to be the lightning rod. And because of this intersectionality, and it seems to be, when you break it all down, it's, do you believe in the traditional family or not? It doesn't mean that, you have to have a stay-at-home mom. You don't have to have, that's not what this is about. This is about gender. It's about marriage. It's about having kids. It's about supporting the family, a traditional family. Greg, is that where we're going to come to? Is that what it's going to come down to? Is this proclamation on the family?
That's the flashpoint. And yes, I think the proclamation on the family, its implications, its cultural, all the moral and cultural vision that it implies, how can it not come down to this? And sometimes critics of what shall I call it, moral and cultural conservatism will say, well, why this obsession with sexual morality and so forth? Well, excuse me. The left, especially since the 60s, but this has deep roots. You could trace this back to the Marxist appropriation of Nietzsche and Freud, which colors the whole 20th century. The left has been obsessed with sexual liberation, even to the exclusion of traditional leftist concern with class, material class issues of wealth and poverty and distribution and so forth. Those haven't gone away, but the spiritual, not in a good sense, core of the left since the 60s has been sexual liberation. We didn't make this the issue. Shall I call myself a conservative? I don't mind being called a conservative. If conservative means standing by the broad vision of the human being and the nature of human existence that is implicit in the proclamation on the family. So that will be a touchstone, and that really is a Solzhenitsyn speaks, as you know, of a line between good and evil going through the heart of every individual. That's relevant to the ideological concerns we share. But you could say that right through our society and through the heart of every citizen and Latter-day Saint is driven this question: befriend the traditional family, and I know a lot goes into refining that definition of what that can mean, befriending the traditional family and the sexual morality pertaining to it, or throwing in with the cause of boundless liberation from the traditional family. We're not making it up when we say that that's what's at stake. And what makes an intellectual leftish, I would say, is more fundamentally than anything a hostility to the principles of the Declaration, the Proclamation on the Family, and that hostility. Only God can search hearts. I don't know what's in the heart of all faculty members at BYU. You have all gradations of sympathy or antipathy to the proclamation. But I think that the tipping point is, do you really embrace it, and are you willing to defend it by faith and by reason? Or do you find it vaguely an embarrassment or something that maybe we can get beyond, or we wouldn't want to focus on because that would be disreputable from an academic point of view, et cetera? That's really the dividing line. And I think we have crossed a tipping point in terms of I don't know what the numbers are. And it's not really the raw numbers that matter if we knew them in terms of where the majority of faculty stand. What matters is what activist groups have confidence, have a kind of see themselves as occupying a moral high ground and are conceded that moral high ground by others. And I think we've gone past that tipping point, and it won't be easy. It won't be pretty to tip back the other way.
Yeah, it seems to me that we've passed that tipping point too, which is why this year, I mean, I'm expecting things to get even bolder on that side of things at BYU. So here's my last point about BYU. One thing that I've been studying and noticing is the infusion of a critical social justice language into culture. And so we're starting to hear a lot more of the words of intersectionality, pedagogy, hegemony. These words that really, if you go follow them through dialectic, et cetera, you can follow the DNA back through, from what I see, mostly a continental philosophy that is coming back in through Marx and Engels and Hegel and Kant and Gramsci and just that same hard left DNA. And it seems to me, as Derrida went over, he said late in his career, I think it was at UCI when he did this, but he said, everything that I have done, of course I'm paraphrasing here, but everything that I have done has been to try and create a virus. It's really what he said. And you'll actually see a lot of academic papers that say the same thing as they're trying to move in these specializations and they're trying to support their work. They talk about this actually being a virus. They revel in it even. And a lot of that virus, Derrida was a literary critic, has to do with language. And so these words and these phrases are coming up more and more They're mostly academic phrases, and a lot of them, they've been used for a long time in academia, but they seem to have been growing in usage quite a bit. I want to go over just a couple things here. One, you wrote in your book, The Responsibility of Reason, you said, I may as well admit, this is in your introduction, I may as well admit that I am a professor of writing to other professors and their students, but I confess in advance to the professional deformation that is the cost of pursuing a conversation to a very few. Now, you're not really talking about those types of words here, but the principle applies in that there is I'll go as far to say it's a newspeak in academia, that you have these words that misogynistic, cis, again, intersectionality, these different words that are in a way, they're elitist. They're academic elitist words and phrases and concepts that as you introduce the words, you end up with a bumper sticker kind of an idea for students and for the culture as a whole, that they start adopting them without actually drilling down into where the sources are of these words and what the DNA is that is attached to them. You cannot bring in the words without bringing in the ideas. And so academia has become, it is to me, really starting to form culture, much more than it has in the past. Lastly, I'm going to add this in here. This is, you're talking about an address by President Kimball in an article that you put together for, I believe this was First Things. It's called Keeping Faith in Provo. And you said, during this period of compromise, faculty and students were often encouraged by church and university leaders, beginning with Kimball, to develop a capacity for bilingualism, an ability to speak both the language of the academy and the language of revealed truths. It seems to me like we're moving much more, even at BYU, in fact, very much so, into the language of academy and fewer words and phrases of revealed truths. Continues here, you say, it was generally stipulated or assumed that the language of faith would be the primary idiom that reflected a scholar's deepest understanding. But the risk was always present that the language associated with academic prestige would, often quite surreptitiously, become the dominant or default language. And religious language, I know this is long, but I think it's important, and religious language secondary and eventually subordinate. There comes a point where the secular framework, having been purged of old integrating questions concerning the moral and religious dimensions of the human condition, can no longer be translated into the community's authoritative religious idiom. When this happens, faith is left speechless, defenseless, resourceless. This was 2013. Where are we now in 2021 with this bilingualism?
Or 2014 maybe, but
okay.
But no matter. Well, the way of talking about the faith and reason, or the faithful and scholarly university in terms of bilingualism, it's a nice figure of speech that illuminates a lot. But the obvious problem is these languages have to be, at least to a large degree, translatable into each other, or there has to be a large degree of overlapping in the assumptions at work, or else, one language is simply using the other purely instrumentally and actually deceitfully, unless the languages of this bilingualism actually represent substantially overlapping worldviews. Well, that's the condition which existed to some degree at a certain stage, maybe at the high point of BYU's accomplishment in roughly the time that President Kimball was speaking, perhaps. A moment in the West and in America and for the church in which it was at least plausible. The hope was plausible that we could hold these languages together. That I don't think that could be said the same way today because the languages have drifted apart. But to come to the question of of elite vocabulary and its reception in slogans and buzzwords among ordinary folks. In a way, what I was preparing to argue in my book, The Responsibility of Reason, when I was excusing myself for my very apparently specialized and highly unfamiliar approach, I was really apologizing for what follows from undertaking the task of trying to mediate between these languages. And that requires some deep diving philosophically. And it's this kind of diving that is not encouraged by the contemporary academy. But in your, you mentioned a kind of diagnosis of our present distemper in terms of a certain intellectual history that especially has roots in Continental philosophy, all the way from, let's say, Hegel to Derrida, whom you mentioned. This kind of diagnosis is important and illuminating. Let me call it the diagnosis of our present disarray in terms of an elite intellectual conspiracy, because that, in effect, is what we are charging Derrida and the cultural Marxists or the authors of critical race theory. This is what we are charging them with imposing a vocabulary that brings with it a worldview that they embrace intentionally and that they hope others will absorb through the vocabulary that they're promoting. So that kind of, there's much truth in that diagnosis of our, I've said distemper, disarray, confusion, corruption, diagnosis in terms of elite conspiracy. But the other side of the truth is we wouldn't catch the virus if we weren't at some deep level vulnerable to it. And to understand this side of the story, I think an author like Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville, one of the great touchstones of my intellectual career, who wrote Democracy in America in the 1830s, Tocqueville understood the deep sources, psychological, social, spiritual, and intellectual, the deep sources that make us vulnerable to what is in fact an intellectual conspiracy, owing to a kind of a fundamental commitment to, well, it's hard to avoid saying controversial things here, a fundamental commitment to freedom and equality, the very premises of liberalism, which is, although who's not in favor of freedom and equality? But if you take those in a radical sense, they are boundless, utopian, eventually nihilistic in their implications, in a way that makes just regular citizens of a democracy vulnerable to the virus of extremism. There are two kinds of diagnoses that are complementary, but it matters to keep both in mind: diagnoses of our present ideological confusion and distemper. One I would call the an enemy hath done this diagnosis, tracing the development of ideologies through a conspiracy of intellectuals. There's truth in that, much truth. But the other is the Tocquevillian, what shall I label it, diagnosis. The problem lies in ourselves diagnosis, which actually strikes deeper and is more challenging, because it says This comes back to your questions about liberalism, classical and radical, or liberalism and radicalism. What it means is that as liberalisms go, I'm all in favor of classical liberalism, or what I call practical liberalism, but without a supplement, without a foundation, without cultural and religious resources that liberalism, even classical, cannot provide, a liberal democratic people is profoundly vulnerable to the secular religions propounded by the conspiracy of intellectuals.
Ralph, do you think Tocqueville's insights are rooted somewhat in a contrast between the French Revolution and the American Revolution and the ideals that ended up being held up as a way forward, especially late iterations of the French Revolution?
Well, certainly the French Revolution, American founding distinction was pivotal for Tocqueville's analysis, and more generally the French-American comparison with some British comparisons thrown in was fundamental. But underlying that, so yes, understanding how democracy is okay and even promising in America, but the same language, essentially liberal Lockean language, filtered through Rousseau, you could say, proved disastrous in the French Revolution. That's a fundamental point of Tocqueville's. But more deeply, he presents us with a profound civilizational divide between what he calls, you have to be careful not to take these terms too narrowly, aristocracy and democracy, by which he's writing more in terms of a broad cultural sociology than in terms of a institutional political analysis. He's speaking of a traditional versus a modern society when he says aristocracy and democracy. And let me bring this back to your question about the 60s and the wake of its radicalism in which we are still living today. I mean, because of my generation, as signified by my hair color, I'm sometimes dismissed by saying, well, you baby boomers, well, you naturally think your generation was important and everything goes back to the 60s. Well, excuse me, actually, much does go back to the 60s. I was just listening to a YouTube of a conference of some French philosophers and sociologists not long ago, and they're by no means conservative or religious. They're scientific and progressive scholars, but one of them said very pointedly that the civilizational revolution of the 1960s was the greatest in, I believe he said, the history of civilization. I don't know the whole history of civilizations, so I won't say that, but it's plausible. This is a divide, an abyssal divide that cannot be overstated, because the divide really is between, again, a traditional and a thoroughly radically modern society. And what is the hinge of that divide? It's really the question of whether human beings are subject to laws and limits in God or in nature, the laws of nature and nature's God, to evoke the Declaration of Independence, whether human beings finally are limited by a source of moral authority above them, or whether fundamentally we're making it all up for ourselves according to our own desires or self-creation. That's the fundamental question. It's been with us since Tocqueville's day and before. It goes back to the foundations of modern thought. If I could start getting into my own intellectual history style of diagnosis, which would go all the way back to the 16th century. But the point is that the seeds lie deep, and the cultural effusion and destruction of the 60s was the reaping of a whirlwind that was sown centuries ago and that lies deep. And what's intellectually, philosophically fruitful about the present moment is that we can't come to grips with what's happening without taking all that in hand, without going to the most fundamental premises, which I would say lie beneath classical liberalism. I'm a friend of classical liberalism. It cannot save us. It does not have the, practically speaking, I wish for it. I wish for dialogue. I wish for openness and tolerance. But these will not happen without the rescue of a common spiritual core that has eroded and then been blasted away.
Well, it seems to me that one of the problems with classical liberalism is a defense mode, right? There really isn't much of a defense mode on leaning on the left side over there, because you can see what's happening right now is you have the, they're mostly what you used to have. What you used to have was a much more classical liberal type of attitude in academia. And now there's no check to the left flank, right? There doesn't seem to be a defense mode against the left flank, the hard left in classical liberalism. Bringing up the gospel, that might be the only check, I think, that could be infused into classical liberalism that would say, wait a minute, this over here, maybe I don't have a defense mode in classical liberalism enough that says I've got a line here that where this can't cross. This harder ideology cannot cross over into my left-leaning worldview. But the gospel, at least, if I have a left-leaning view of the world, the gospel at least would give me some defense, because now I've got something to contrast.
Okay. I much sympathize, but the gospel cannot be the only check if anything like a school in Zion, as evoked by President Holland, is possible. We must have rational, reasonable, rigorously reasoned things to say about or in contesting this cultural or anti-cultural norm, which increasingly engulfs us. But you point to the underlying spiritual problem and the reason why classical liberalism, and I would celebrate any degree of return to a more classical liberal mood and framework for our universities and our societies. But you point to the defect of that hope when you mention the lack of defenses to the left. I mean, the French left in, I think it was in the 1930s, had a saying that goes directly to this point. It's, excuse my French, it's pas d'ennemi à gauche. There's no enemy on the left. Well, that completely captures the attitude of liberals throughout the ages and in our universities, including our Latter-day Saint universities today. Oh, the real problem, I mean, that against which we are united in our identity as professors and academics and intellectuals, the real threat is that, like, people would actually believe what they were taught in Sunday school and on their mother's knee, and they wouldn't take us to be their intellectual heroes. So you mentioned this. This is the way that professors know that they are important, by undermining what other people in their Sunday school class or their mothers think. Okay, but this is not accidental. This vulnerability to the left is part of the DNA of the left, or I would say of modern so-called rationalism, going back to the beginning, because this modern rationalism is ultimately parasitic on a Christian hope for a kind of universal salvation. So whoever promises, how can a classical liberal stand up to the promises of a cultural Marxist or another kind of utopian who says, no, we can have peace and brotherhood if we can make love, not war, if we only get over all our sexual hang-ups and institute complete equality? How can a classical liberal answer that by saying, well, actually, moderation has its attractions, and can't we just all get along and be objective and listen to other people? Spiritually, that is not an answer.
my concern, I see what you're saying. My concern is then if it's the gospel's not enough, okay, we need rhetorical, we need tools then, as you say, to fight against this. I don't think that without the support of the classical liberal world in the United States, that this thing is stopped. I just don't know if that can happen. So if that's the case, I'm making an assumption there.
Yeah.
But if that's the case, how do we give classical liberalism the tools then, and where do they come from in order to be able to fight this?
So you and I agree that maybe it's too late to preserve, somehow reinstituting something more like classical liberalism is the one thing needful. But the point of my diagnosis is to say that classical liberalism, and this is a very Tocquevillian point, classical liberalism never worked, was never healthy without drawing upon sources, religious and traditional. Tocqueville would use the nasty word aristocratic, upon which modern rationalistic secular democracy has always depended, upon which it has always been parasitic. So we've reached a cultural moment where it's a fun, interesting time for political philosophers, but a very hazardous time, because we've reached a moment when we have to confront the increasingly urgent necessity of reconnecting liberalism with its not illiberal or non-liberal or anti-liberal, but its non-liberal sources. A close friend of mine, and as good a voice as you'll find on these subjects, Daniel J. Mahoney, has a book whose title says this perfectly: The Conservative Roots, or does he say foundations? The conservative foundations of the liberal order. That's the whole point. We want liberalism, but precisely because we are friends of liberalism in the more classical, practical sense, we recognize that it depends upon non-liberal sources.
So we've lost then, Ralph. I mean, through secularism, let's say then, through secularism, the classical liberal has lost its defenses. Yes,
I think that's right. The trying to stand on his own feet, he finds that he's on very, the classical liberal, finds that he's on very shaky ground, because liberalism has always depended upon spiritual and cultural resources that it could not produce. Classical liberalism cannot account, let's say, John Locke cannot account for the whole human being and the character formation that is necessary to make a good citizen of a liberal democracy. Locke was very attentive to that question, though, but I have problems with the way he went about that. But if we're citing major philosophical figures in the history of liberalism, all you have to do is look at John Stuart Mill, who in many ways is taken to be as signal a figure of classical liberalism, individual liberty as there can be. But I'm sorry, read utilitarianism, and you will see that Mill himself is more than vulnerable to a highly utopian vision of a utilitarian society completely rationalized by a new secular religion, in which that new religion will effectively be propounded by and enforced by the state. So that, in Mill himself, we have a case study of liberalism's vulnerability to the hard left, or even to a totalitarian temptation.
I want to jump over to something else here. The fundamental difference here that I'm seeing that is really playing out. And as I look at something, Ralph, like critical race theory or social justice, all these things, in the end, to me, what I've seen is that I can strip down the issue of, for example, race in critical race theory. Race is not the issue, as I see it. The issue is much deeper than that. The issue with critical race theory is more of a Marxian type of utopia. It's the same idea, right? It's the idea of taking the hard left idea of equity of results. And so there's always this. You look at the idea of classical liberalism, of liberal democracy, that says, hey, we want to set ideals for society and for everybody to choose if they're able to reach those ideals and if they want to reach those ideals, and create a society where we have support and opportunity of advancing and moving forward, a society of liberty, right? On one end, that would be equality. And I'm using now the leftists' terms here, but that would be equality. On the other end of the spectrum, on the far left end of the spectrum, they use the term equity much more now. And they would define equity not as an equality of opportunity, but actually the forced equality of results is where equity comes in. And so it's very much going to obviously produce conflict and conflict theory and, fighting against hegemony and power battles that are going to move forward, right? This is what the hard left does. I've got a quote here from President Oaks. He said, "The equality of God is not the equal outcomes for all, but equal opportunity for all." Do you see in this, as the hard left is making its push forward right now, the same thing as what President Oaks said? And is that kind of a warning statement then for us to understand that forced equality and those ideologies that would try to accomplish that have a type of dystopian utopia? Is that what's happening?
Well, first of all, that's a powerful quote from President Oaks, and I certainly embrace it. There's certainly no question that I favor equality of opportunity over the ideological rhetoric of equity. But let me say this: I mean, really, the relationship between this equality as an equality of opportunity and equity is a version of the problem of classical liberalism and radicalism. So the same thing holds true. Equality of opportunity is inherently an unstable notion if it does not seek its roots into other sources of meaning. I'll come back to that, but let me just say, I mean, you're right about the Marxist inspiration, therefore a kind of radical egalitarian inspiration behind critical race theory. But really, we always have to keep in mind that don't underestimate the purely negative motivations and implications of these radical movements. As in Marx, they can always say what they're against, the bourgeoisie, existing society with its inevitable inequalities and so forth. They can always say what they're against, but how would this actually look? And how would your vision actually be implemented? They're always weak on that. They get their energy, the hard left, the cultural Marxists, the critical race theorists, they get their energy from attacking any civilizational norms and structures that exist. And of course, in a way, it's always open season because civilizations are imperfect and the norms that exist are always imperfect, biased. Some always do better under these norms than others. That will always be the case. But the hard left, which is increasingly the left, feeds off this resentment against the imperfections of an existing society. But just to come back to the terms equality and equity, I'm in favor of equality of opportunity. I mean, whenever I need a shot in the arm to recover my inspiration for democracy properly understood, I go to Abraham Lincoln, for example. And when Abraham Lincoln speaks eloquently of the American idea as giving everyone a fair chance in the race of life, well, that's beautiful and good, and we embrace that, except even this can be interpreted in a utopian way. Because think about it. What would it mean radically to enforce or to strive for, to implement pure equality of opportunity? What would it mean to say that everyone really has a strictly equal chance in the race of life? Can you even conceive that? First of all, are we going to equalize natural gifts, intelligence, industry, just the capacities that, energy, ambition, things that are partly genetic? How would you equalize? I had good parents in a good home, and I grew up with confidence and some stable structures. I had a much better chance in the race of life than somebody who came from a broken family. What are we going to do? Like do away with the family in order to make all chances equal? The idea of the pure idea of equality of opportunity. That the pure ideal of equality of opportunity shades into this boundless demand for equity. And equity means that any inequality you can point to is a sign that we haven't reached utopia and more destruction is warranted.
Ralph, you talk about a contrast between practical liberalism versus a theoretical liberalism. And I heard you mention this, and you place the family squarely with practical liberalism, but not as part of theoretical liberalism. What do you mean by practical liberalism, and what do you mean by theoretical liberalism, and why is the family one of the major distinctions between those two?
Well, practical liberalism overlaps largely with the classical liberalism that you like to evoke. But what it means is that liberalism in practice, I mean, as it operated admirably by historical standards with all its imperfections in the American Republic up to the 1960s and hopefully beyond, that this practical liberalism is a liberalism that it's not theoretical because it doesn't try to explain everything or to provide its own foundations. It's content to operate within the cultural inheritances that it didn't create. It's parasitic, more or less knowingly, upon non-liberal sources of meaning. Theoretical liberalism is just another way of saying radical liberalism. It wants to go to the roots and effectively implement. It wants to make operational what are in fact the radical philosophical premises of liberalism, going back to its foundations in Locke and in Thomas Hobbes, I would say. And that foundation is the radical separateness of the individual as equal and free in a state of nature in which no moral authority, no law above the individual's own self-construction exists. That premise has been bubbling under the surface at least since the 17th century.
So is this a major focus of even looking today, right, of how things are playing out on the left versus the right today? Would the individual be at the center of this, and the idea of individual freedom versus a collective good?
Well, that's a rather liberal way of framing the problem, which means there's truth in it, but it seems to me it doesn't get to the bottom of things. But both you've pointed out that individualism shows up on both sides in a way, in both extremes of the American political spectrum. What I'm saying in a way is that's the problem. We're going to have to, individual liberty, of course, is at the moral core of any wholesome vision of the meaning of America. But just what does that liberty mean, and what are its preconditions? So you have the leftist sexual revolutionaries or radicals of identity politics, but of course you have the libertarian element on the right or among conservatives that tries to explain conservatism or a libertarian position wholly in terms of the isolated individual as the premise of political and moral theory. It won't work. It can't be done. And that's why, and really, the left will always outbid the libertarian right. Libertarians drift left. It shouldn't be a surprise. The left will always outbid the libertarian right in trying to give human meaning to the very process of liberation from traditional norms. But you asked about the family. You can see how all this relates to the family. And by the way, Tocqueville is perfectly clear and acute on this subject. I mean, Tocqueville, in some some remarkable chapters in the second volume of Democracy in America, Tocqueville shows that American womanhood and the self-understanding, the moral and religious understanding of womanhood held by American women is the anchor of the family, therefore of American morality, therefore of American democracy.
Interesting.
Religion and sexual morality are an essential support of democracy, according to Tocqueville, because the family is in a way, the primary, the primordial, and flagrantly obvious response to the philosophical premises of radical liberalism or individualism. We are born into a family. We come forth from a father and especially from a mother. We depend upon them. Through them, we are decisively framed into one cultural civilizational form or another. If individualism is the pure and simple truth, the family is merely a malleable accident whose influence we should try to minimize if we can't overcome it altogether.
Or even, as I've seen even a hegemonic structure.
Right.
It's brought up oftentimes right now. Would you say then, talking about individualism, then maybe I could rephrase it and say, as two sides of the coin here, is it more an individualism that would be supported in terms of agency and opportunity versus an individualism that seeks for liberation from again, using a leftist terms here, but from a hegemonic structure or many hegemonic structures, including family? And
yes, Greg, but agency, what was the term you paired with agency? Agency itself can be interpreted from either within the modern liberationist perspective or from an alternative perspective. Again, nobody's stronger on this than Tocqueville. Tocqueville hates the word individualism, but he loves the word liberty, even individual liberty. Why is this? Because true freedom depends upon, Tocqueville sometimes uses the term greatness or grandeur. It depends upon being connected with something above ourselves. True freedom cannot be a creation of the individual, because that will be weak, subject to the tyranny of the majority and to the tyranny of a utopian view of history or its progress. Individual liberty depends upon what my friend, French friend Remy Brague called an anchor in the heaven. We need something to stand up for. We may claim all the pure individual liberty we like, but if it's not anchored in something higher, in some higher belief, in some higher reference point, in some higher good, some higher law, it will fall to the fads, the tyrannies of the day. There is no individual liberty without something above the individual. There is no true agency that is not moral agency, that does not operate within a moral and I would say a familial framework.
Okay. Now let me circle this back to the church here. This was 2013. You mentioned in an article, you said Mormon progressivism is still quite a marginal movement, and I would not want to exaggerate its importance. And certainly within the progressive tendency, there are as many versions as there are souls, including many sincere believers with sincere questions. This is in progressivism among the Mormons in 2013. Is Mormon progressivism still, quote, a marginal movement?
Well, I was probably speaking somewhat optimistically and trying not to sound immoderate or alarmist when I said that. But no, that would be harder to say today, wouldn't it? And it's because the progressive vocabulary very often with little understanding of the worldview premises that accompany that vocabulary, but that vocabulary has sunk deeper and deeper into. So I think we're really in and I'm speaking mainly of places and congregations I know in North America. I'm sure other places in the developed world are, and almost the whole world is developed now with cell phones and media and so forth. But just speaking of the North American church, and again, it's never a question of absolute numbers. It's a question of those who are culturally active and confident, if not aggressive and influential. And for those people, there are more and more who, the category of those who think of themselves as faithful, even orthodox, but whose worldview has really been affected by a template that I would say doesn't come from the gospel, but that depends upon premises of a secular utopianism. That cast of mind is becoming ever more common, which I think portends how can this not portend a separation of sheep from goats, or is it wheats and tares? They're really sewn together now, and that division running through the heart of every individual saint will call upon us to make a choice. And I think the choice really does track this fundamental, does track a response to the fundamental proposition put to us by modernity centuries ago, and becoming a decisive cultural fact in the 1960s and beyond. And that question is, are human beings beholden to a good and a law above them? Or is humanity best conceived as an autonomous self-creation?
Can we keep religion and politics separate?
No.
Do we even want to?
No, and we can't. We should want to keep them distinct, but this again is the classical or practical liberalism versus radicalism question that we keep being drawn back into. Classical liberalism upholds something like, or imagines something like, the possibility of a separation of church and state. And there are all kinds of good reasons for that. I mean, again, Tocqueville celebrates the American solution to the religious problem. He sees how fragile and provisional it is, but he celebrates it, and it largely maps the idea of keeping religion and politics separate. But of course, at some deep level, they're never separate, because both politics and religion make very, very comprehensive, if not ultimate, claims upon, well, our loyalties and our souls. Our very sense of our humanity is shaped by the understanding of justice, liberty, equality, for example, that is worked out in our political debates and political institutions. And those cannot be compartmentalized absolutely with respect to our religious or philosophical principles. So yes, there's good reason to celebrate the distinction and the large practical separateness, but you don't have to look very far to see that even underneath the language of the separation of church and state, there are quasi-religious or anti-religious motives and processes at work. I mean, it comes to a head in public education, for example. So you take your bearings by religion and tradition, or by a utopian hope? That's not a question that can be religiously neutral.
All right. So so we don't want to separate politics from religion. I know that at one point in a fair address that you made, you had invoked Madison in Federalist Paper, I think it was 51, where the pursuit of liberalism, I think it was, classical liberalism, liberal democracy, or the ideals of the Constitution anyway, were based on a pursuit of justice. And that is certainly also seemingly the pursuit, even in language, of the hard left, right? It seems like there's both sides are having a pursuit of justice then. What is the difference there if they're both pursuing justice? Are they both pursuing justice? And is it just a matter of worldview as to what that end game is for what type of justice you're looking for?
When you say a matter of worldview, you suggest the threat of a certain relativism, as if, one person has one worldview, another, and nothing can be said between these. If we accept that, we've accepted the premises of eventually of a kind of nihilism where reason has no purchase on the deepest questions. But this statement of Madison that justice is all what political institutions are about, and they will either, how does he put it, establish it, attain it reasonably, or they will be destroyed. Political institutions will be destroyed in the process. Well, I would say there's much insight in what Madison says there. I would say so much depends upon what we mean by justice and the context in which we value and pursue justice. Do we conceive justice? The religious question is just is closely connected here, but do we conceive justice as a purely mundane and worldly endeavor that must be accomplished in this life, and in which all the demands of our humanity must somehow be met by our political institutions? Because if we put that burden on the meaning of justice, then ideological fanaticism is inevitable. But if justice is understood to be under God and tempered by a higher power and by expectations of otherworldly compensation, for example, and by a kind of an acceptance of the limitations of this, the necessary limitations of this world and the degree to which a perfect justice can be achieved, then we're in a very different framework. Completely secularized justice is inherently radicalized, extreme, ideological justice. And to, you might, the recent conference talk by, now I'm hesitating, was it Elder Renland who spoke of infuriating injustice?
I don't recall.
We'll have to look that up. Who was called at the same time as Elder Renland? I think it was Elder Renland. Edit this and fix it. Because that's a very important talk, because as the title implies, the whole point of the talk is to evoke this passion for justice that is part of our humanity, which we say that's not fair. It's just everything should be fair. That's a natural human instinct. And of course, we always interpret fairness in a partisan way, or from the standpoint of our own ideas and our own interests. But it's all too human to be infuriated by injustice, and up to a point, that's a good thing if it stirs productive efforts to make the world fair. But at a certain point, we have to. I think, in a way, if you follow this talk, infuriating injustice, you'll see that the main point of the talk is not to dissolve, to quiet our passion for justice, and to help us realize that we may not know just what justice is, or part of life is to recognize that life isn't fair. The whole point of this conference talk is to take some pressure away from political justice and put it in the context of religious hopes and religious motives. If you compare that to a recent talk about racial justice at BYU by Ryan Gabriel, in my view, you'll find a completely different spirit. In Professor Gabriel's devotional address, which has been widely hailed, and I don't know if anyone has ever criticized it. So here I am, as sometimes happens, the first to do so. In that talk, you see a rather breathtaking passage from a spiritual talk about the atonement and our brotherhood and sisterhood under God, to a mobilizing of political forces to create equity in this world. I mean, to me, Professor Gabriel's talk is in an utterly different spirit than the infuriating injustice conference talk.
Okay. You talk a lot about reason in your writings, Ralph, and at one point you had referenced Thomas Aquinas and his belief that you need to take revelation and filter it through reason. How does that work for Latter-day Saints in pulling those two things together? I think of so many things now. There's so many. Where does revelation fit with reason, and how do you play on both of those? Which is more important? Are they both equally important? How do we work through those things?
What is the true understanding of reason and revelation? Professor Hancock is here today to answer this age-old question of Western civilization for you. Well, it turns out I thought about this, and I have some things to say about it. And by the way, this is the moment at which to mention that I'd kind of left behind the institutional question concerning BYU that strictly correlates with this question about reason and revelation. That, as you were suggesting, maybe the only stopping point from radicalization is the gospel. Well, I embrace the gospel as a check on an alternative to radical liberalism or liberationism. But I wanted to say, and this bears on the reason revelation question, if the gospel, if faith in the revealed gospel in its bare revealed form, let me put it that way, is the only alternative to the slippery slope of liberalism to liberationism and radicalism and utopianism, then President Holland's vision of a school in Zion has no footing, no foundation, because reason has nothing to say on its own in contradiction of radicalized secularism. This I contest in the most fundamental way. We must not concede the honor of reason to radical secularism. We must not, something so unreasonable and inhumane cannot be honored with the term rational. If the idea of BYU makes any sense, it must be the case, and this is the genius of President Holland's talk, that the if not the harmony, the continuity that he conceives between the educational establishment or the scholarly academy and the gospel, that continuity is made possible by a conception of reason that is reasonable and, in a word, holistic, or seeks for a kind of comprehensive wisdom and goodness that asks the big questions about the right and the good. These are the most rational questions, which modern liberalism suppresses, and therefore it becomes radicalism. The questions of purpose. Modern rationalists would have us think that suppressing the question of purpose, including a higher purpose, is irrational. But what could be more rational? Our 2-year-olds know how to keep asking why, but our scientific or scholarly scruples and our specializing disciplines want to suppress that question. So, without the only way to hold together reason and revelation is a view of reason that shares questions with revelation and that overlaps on some ultimate concerns. And you mentioned, you used the term filtering. Did you say that revelation was filtering reason or reason filtering revelation? Well, I guess I'd be bold enough to say both have to be true. There are inevitable and extremely valuable feedback loops in both directions between our faithful openness to revelation and our confidence in some essential premises of human reason. We cannot be good, faithful Latter-day Saints if we have no confidence in our natural ability to distinguish a good human being from one that is vicious or ideologically crazy or what have you.
Well, the Lord seems to do this actually in the scriptures a few times. Isaiah comes to mind where he actually brings it down to our level in a sense, revelation to our level. And he says, come, let us reason together. Right? It's a reasoning that is tied directly to his revelation. Then very similar to what you're saying here. I do have a question. If I'm running the DNA back for reason, maybe rationality, and revelation on the other hand, if I go back and I look at the Enlightenment and a kind of scientific positivism that develops, where many will say that this is a pushback on revelation. It is moving man forward, progressing from living in a metaphysical, religious, mythical world, and then finally bringing it down to hard sciences and positivism and saying, Okay, well now we're into pure reason now at this point, and so there'd be a pushback on religion then and revelation, relying on ourselves for reasoning. At the same time, America is a product of the Enlightenment, and yet it seems to have gone back and said in its foundation and pushed back on that secularism that I don't think always we see with the Continental nihilism, for example, and critical approach, where it brings back revelation and tries to combine it with that reasoning through the Enlightenment. Is that a proper statement?
Well, you see, we're back to the classical or practical liberalism question, because the American founding is the high point or the touchstone of liberalism in its soundest, most practical or classical sense. And so it's a successful version of the Enlightenment, which in a way was Tocqueville's whole point. But why was it successful? Because it wasn't pure, because it admitted heterogeneous elements. So thinking about the American founding, for example, you find some more radical Enlightenment style enthusiasms in Thomas Jefferson, for example, who, in some respects, despite his libertarian themes that conservatives can harvest, on the whole, you find a sympathy to the French Revolution and a more radical rationalism in Jefferson than in, I suppose I'd say, any other leading founder. But look at George Washington and his speeches. Now, he's not credited as being a philosopher or a political theorist on a par with Madison or John Adams or Hamilton or James Wilson, for example. I think in some ways he's better than that, because Washington was wise and good, and in his rhetoric, as is well known, I think he relied upon the help of Hamilton and Madison. I mean, imagine that collaboration and that administration to draft his speeches, but they were his speeches. And what you find in his speeches, a celebration of the Enlightenment in the most flagrantly Christian or providential perspective, and one that plainly acknowledges that liberalism, or that self-government, he would say, is only sound upon a moral and religious foundation. He says as much. So, I mean, our theoretical liberals would want to dismiss that, or that was public rhetoric, and that's not a philosopher speaking, that's just George Washington. But for me, therein lies wisdom. America expressed, embodied, and implemented the Enlightenment most successfully because it did not do so purely, because it represented a kind of practical synthesis. I like to see it as a tripartite synthesis, really. Let's call it three parts: Enlightenment rationalism, Christian faith, but also kind of traditional political experience and the common law and the practical experience of self-government. That's what made liberalism work. Now, of course, I've passed right over the original sin of slavery, which must be acknowledged, but it really doesn't change the picture. Because Washington, and for that matter, Jefferson, not to mention the New England founders like John Adams, they were utterly, acutely aware that slavery and the way of life and institutions surrounding it were ultimately incompatible with American principles.
Okay. It seems to me, from the outsider looking in, that Continental philosophy does a lot of what you just talked about. It actually raises up the Enlightenment, which is a good principle, but takes a very critical view in a sense, and a very secular view, leaving out revelation, leaving out religion. And that seems to be in contrast to going more to a Scottish Enlightenment, right? Or moving over to Locke and Hobbes and moving all the way down, coming up towards Strauss, for example. Is that the schism? Is that what's playing out today? Is that schism between those two branches?
Excellent question. And you've mentioned Leo Strauss, who is very important to my education, someone I've engaged, and that to whom I owe immensely for my own outlook and intellectual resources, but with whom I've also disagreed. In case your listeners don't know, Leo Strauss was a German emigre political philosopher who came to America during the war, I think, escaping as a Jew and a powerful thinker, escaping Nazi Germany. And Leo Strauss was responsible for the recovery of political philosophy in the large, broad-gauged sense in which I've been evoking it today. And it's because I learned about him at Harvard in my graduate education that has made all the difference for me and the way that I analyze these questions. But so let me give you very briefly a brief sketch of my overview of where the bodies are buried in terms of Western intellectual and philosophical history. There is a kind of a bifurcation in the Enlightenment that you mentioned between the Scottish, which would include Adam Smith and David Hume and Thomas Reid, less well known now, but extremely important in the early American Republic. So you have a Scottish philosophy of common sense, which the name says it all, which tries to keep the radical intellectual aggression of the Enlightenment in check and in touch with sort of common sense principles of morality and a certain friendship to the morality inherited from Christianity. That, as opposed to the Continental vein, which is more radically and in a way philosophically more attractive to many because of its radicalism, which leads through Rousseau. And there's really quite an explicit paternity here from Rousseau to Kant and Hegel, and then a reaction against what was almost an official German philosophy by Marx, and then Nietzsche. Two extremes that I've suggested earlier kind of meet each other. So you have this continental strand of philosophy, of which for the 20th century in our day, I would still say that Martin Heidegger, who wrote Being and Time in the 1920s and survived, I think, into the 1970s. Martin Heidegger is still the linchpin of what we consider continental philosophy in our times. And I would say that in comparison with Anglo-American thought and a kind of roughly Humean, Lockean analytical tradition, continental philosophy is in a way deeper, more ambitious, more penetrating, and for that reason, more apt to both to do good and to do harm. Well, Leo Strauss comes up from the continent in his own way. He's a very continental philosopher who is modifying Heidegger's project in a decisive way. This is getting too long already, but I would say that both Leo Strauss and Heidegger, as continental philosophers, radically criticize the Enlightenment, but Heidegger and the continental philosophy that follows from him tends to throw the baby out with the bathwater. The bathwater being the positivistic, materialistic rationalism of the Enlightenment, the bathwater being the classical tradition of political and moral philosophy that was continued in medieval Christian thought. Leo Strauss's great contribution, and his different from Heidegger, they agree in their critique of modern rationalism. The difference between Leo Strauss's and Nietzsche's and Heidegger's responses to the perceived, I think rightly perceived, ultimate bankruptcy of the Enlightenment and therefore of modern rationalism is that Strauss wants to preserve a core of Western civilization grounded in the classics, in Plato and Aristotle particularly. And here I warm to this and also to Thomas Aquinas's version of this story, in that I think a natural, rational understanding of virtue is essential even to a healthy religious life and to Christianity not losing its bearings in the radical flux of modern ideology.
Okay. Yeah, and that's so. Would you say that's what's playing out? I mean, as far as the left and the right today, then is it that schism, that bifurcation, as you say?
The bifurcation between the parts of the Enlightenment, or between Leo Strauss and Martin Heidegger, both in a way. The deeper question. See, this is the question of classical liberalism is the doctrine of the moderate enlightenment, and I've already argued that. While I much favor, I embrace that mood and that viewpoint, broadly speaking, classical liberalism depends upon the Enlightenment, and so it cannot really provide its own foundations.
It's not enough.
It's not enough. The foundations must be sought earlier. This doesn't mean we're going back to a Greek polis or to a medieval arrangement of church and state, anything like that. What it means is that we have to begin by finding a reasoned confidence in the natural goodness of virtue, in what is virtuous, lovely, of good report, and praiseworthy, to quote the 13th article of faith, quoting St. Paul. I am a 13th article of faith Latter-day Saint and an Aristotelian, a follower of Aristotle and in a way, therefore, of Thomas Aquinas, Latter-day Saint. If we cannot agree as reasonable people that some things are virtuous, lovely, honorable, and praiseworthy, and other things are vicious and ugly and deformed and even satanic, to refer to some ideological passions of our own day, if we can't agree on this rationally, then actually I'm almost prepared to say that our common commitment to revelation won't do us any good if this revelation is not, you use the word filtered, if it's not filtered through, if it's not reconciled with a natural understanding of elementary right and wrong and virtue and vice.
Yeah. I think that in some ways it's, the reasoning it needs to be developed, right? Through knowledge. That's why we're told to read from the best books, find, new languages and the structure and nature of different ideas and nations, because the more touch points we have to reason, I think, then the revelation that we receive can, we could say filtered, but it gives it more context, I think, to some degree, right? I mean, you say it's pure revelation, but the more I know about something, the more I think I can be informed through revelation. Well, and the more I can reason through what I'm hearing.
Right. I may disturb some people by saying this, but I don't think, in a sense, there's a thing of pure revelation, and it's beautiful, but it's always mediated, appropriated. It only becomes a practical value to us as we integrate it with a practical and therefore reasoned orientation to life. Pierre Manent, if I may mention another bibliographic reference, Manent, contemporary French political philosopher. Pierre Manent says this beautifully in a speech he gave at Lent in Notre Dame before the terrible fire there a few years ago on reason and faith. And he starts by saying reason is primary. Well, this is a faithful Catholic believer and author. But reason is, in a way, primary because Aristotle wasn't wrong when he said that we are rational, and by the way, that implies political beings. We make our way in life through our understanding. We have some like maps in our mind of what it all means and what our priorities are and what is good and bad, just and unjust. Religion, faith do not relieve us of our human responsibility to act by our best lights. And
I think that's such an important message.
Yeah, revelation can guide us in improving our natural understanding. There's no pure reason, there's no pure revelation. Both have to do with the ultimate questions in which, with respect to which we're already always somewhat at a loss. We don't have absolute knowledge, but we can have confidence in walking in this life under God through the exercise of our natural faculties.
I think this actually goes right back to Genesis 1:1, right? Where it's in the beginning, which is really the council, I believe, the primordial council, but it's in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, right? It's the same thing. It's what's coming from heaven, the revelation, and the earth is us down here trying to reason through, looking up, and what we're receiving from above. I think that those have got to be brought together. You mentioned Aquinas. I really like Aquinas. I never really liked his argument for the existence of God. I always thought that was very weak. But yeah, I do enjoy reading him and trying to pull those two things together.
Yeah.
And
unfortunately, what most people, if they learn anything, they learn the 5 arguments for the existence of God.
Yes.
And I don't know if they're weak. I haven't mastered them, but I don't care as much about them, and I'm not sure they matter in the way that we modern rationalist logicians want them to matter. I think they should be read evocatively as a way of opening us up to the reality of God. But that aside, what's interesting about Aquinas, and this is part of my mission in life, should the years remain to me to attain any of it, is to help Latter-day Saints see how much we have to learn from and to contribute to a broadly Thomistic and therefore Roman Catholic theological tradition. We really have much more in common with Thomas Aquinas than with Martin Luther or John Calvin, or I would, more controversial to some of my intellectual friends, with Soren Kierkegaard or Emmanuel Levinas. I'll throw all those in. Aquinas versus all those radicals on the question of faith and reason. Aquinas holds them together. At some level, even though he's operating within a classical creedal Trinitarian tradition, which strikes us as very intellectualized with all the talk about the nature of God as pure intellect and pure love, etc. But those, I would say, are finally connected with and even grounded in an understanding of our natural humanity as a capacity for virtue, which God created, and it was very good. No one like Thomas Aquinas can connect us with Aristotle's true insight into the goodness of nature, which is also a true biblical insight. Nobody can do this for us better than Thomas Aquinas. And we have to sort through a lot of tall weeds in terms of like scholastic methodology and sometimes over-multiplied fine distinctions and so forth. But the underlying spirit is at some level deeply congenial to a Latter-day Saint understanding of human proximity to divinity.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It makes me think about what Terrell Givens is doing right now, which I'm really happy about, which is he's, we oftentimes think, and well, certainly the world thinks, that the Latter-day Saint doctrine, the Restoration's DNA, is moving from an apostate Catholicism early on, and then moving down into Martin Luther King as part of that evolution, or Martin Luther, and then kind of here comes Joseph Smith, and it's this long evolution where eventually we have the Restoration that comes up. That's completely false.
The Whig or progressive version of Mormon history, it used to be taught, maybe it still is, in the visitor centers at the Salt Lake Temple, for example, where you would find this comforting historical story of everything prepared Joseph Smith, so that obviously Martin Luther is much closer than the dark ages of medieval Christianity. Well, there are things to be said in Luther's favor, don't get me wrong, but
Sure.
fundamentally, really, it comes down to the reason revelation question, which is also the nature grace question. And Latter-day Saints and the best Catholic Thomistic theology hold together reason and revelation, nature and grace. The radical Protestants and Continental religionists following in the wake of Kierkegaard, who of course has many beautiful and fine things to say, but
He does.
ultimately he's a Lutheran who stresses the discontinuity and the rupture between faith and reason, nature and grace. Well, I'm very much on the Thomistic side of that question.
Yeah, what Terrell Givens is doing, he's actually coming back. He's actually pushing back from Protestantism.
Yeah,
not obviously. I mean, with our brothers and sisters that are Protestants, we always have the olive branch out there, and we're trying to make good friends there, and we do. But we need to get away from the thought that we were just the next step, because that takes away everything about an understanding of restoration.
Yeah.
And so Terrell Givens is actually going back to the very early fathers, the patristic teachings, where we have much more in common with them. Irenaeus, for example, or those that come for especially before Augustine, and these teachings are much more in line with our gospel and with the Latter-day Saint doctrine, because it's going back to the beginning.
Right.
And so instead of an evolution of doctrine, we need to look at this as loss over time and then a return to the beginning of what was taught in the New Testament.
Well, Terrell is making a nice contribution there. And I don't recall whether it's in Wrestling the Angel or his more recent book with Fiona, which is a justified polemic against Augustinianism, or maybe in both books. But he's pretty explicit about, in some respects, we're closer to a traditional Catholic sensibility than to a Protestant. Well, we should say there's all kinds of Protestantism too. And what I said about practical and theoretical liberalism would apply to Protestantism at its best, as in like wholesome American Protestantism has made a fine accommodation between reason and revelation. It can happen within Protestantism too. But I think the deepest sources of that reconciliation can be found in Thomas Aquinas. And I'm not saying we should become Thomas, much less Roman Catholics. I'm saying we can understand ourselves better by following his path through some of these fundamental problems of, what shall I call it, theological anthropology, who human beings are in a Christian perspective.
Yeah, I think that's right. I appreciate that. Well, Professor Hancock, thank you so much for your time. We've spent a lot of time here covering numerous topics that very insightful, informative for me. Good luck on your goals here of sitting between, right, the robes of the priesthood of academia and the robes of the priesthood of the gospel, and reaching your arms out and hopefully trying to pull those two things together, because I think it's a very difficult path forward to manage.
Hugh Nibley wouldn't like that formulation,
No.
because he was more, in a way, more Lutheran on that question of reason and revelation than I would be.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks again. Really appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you, Greg.